Hi everyone, welcome. Can you hear me in the back okay? Thank you so much. Thank you back people for doing a great job. Appreciate it. Hello, thank you so much for joining us tonight here at Green Apple Books on the Park. My name is Car Johnson. I'm the events coordinator here for Green Apple. And tonight we have the pleasure of hosting Louise Nayer alongside Frances Phillips to celebrate Louise's memoir, Narrow Escapes. Let's give a hand for both of you ladies. Thank you all so much for joining us both in person and online. Hello, online audience. We appreciate you. We are broadcasting from San Francisco. We are on unceded Ramaytush Ohlone land, and we hope that you join us in our pledge at Green Apple to turn land acknowledgement into land action by either donating your time, brain space, or monetary means to an Indigenous organization every time you hear, or in my case, speak a land acknowledgement. We appreciate that. I have very brief business before I introduce both of the writers that are joining us this evening. First, now is a good time to silence your cell phones if you have not. Oh, right on cue. If you have not already. It's a good time while I'm talking. You're not, missing the fun part. Please do check out our full event calendar at greenapplebooks.com. We have a really great season ahead of us, and if you'll indulge me just one moment, I'm going to tell you in very brief detail about a couple of events we have coming up. On Thursday, April 27th, next Thursday, Eugenia Lee is going to be joining us alongside Jennifer Chang to celebrate her latest collection of poetry, Bianca. And then next Saturday, a week from tomorrow, is April 29th, Independent Bookstore Day, which is our biggest day of the year. We're going to have a lot of fun. Poet Maggie Smith is going to be here signing copies of her book in the morning. We're going to have coffee and mimosas, and we're going to have a drag show in the evening, followed by some live music. And Barrelhead Brewhouse is going to provide some beer, and we'll have a lot of book giveaways and a lot of fun. It's a very fun day, so if you're able to stop by, we always appreciate it. And most bookstores in the city are doing something, so if you want to make a excursion of it for the day, you're welcome to do that. It is quite fun. And last but most certainly not least, thank you so much for buying books from tonight's authors. We have a book of Frances's and a book of Louise's here as well. And we also have other books in the store. If you want to take a look around at those later, you are welcome to. But if you've been here before, you've definitely heard me say that when you buy books from us, not only do you support us as an independent bookstore, but you support the authors who put so much work into writing these books, and then you get to have a book, which might be the best part. So we always appreciate it if you are able. Thank you so kindly. I'm going to go ahead and introduce the authors that are joining us tonight. First, Frances Phillips is recently retired as the program director for arts and at the Creative Work Fund and Arts and the Creative Work Fund at the Walter and Elise Haas Fund, a family foundation based in San Francisco. Prior to her work at the fund, she was executive director of Intersection for the Arts and director and assistant director of the Poetry Center and American Poetry Archives at San Francisco State University, Go Gators, where she also taught creative writing and grant writing for many years. Frances is the author of three small press books of poetry from Hanging Loose Press and Kelsey Street Press. Please give another hand for Frances Phillips. And last but most certainly not least, Louise Nayer is a longtime educator and author of 6 books. Burned, a memoir, was an Oprah Great Read and won the Wisconsin Library Association Award. She received 6 California Arts Council grants as a poet and has taught for years in community colleges, senior centers, and nursing homes. She now teaches at UC Berkeley and at the Writers Grotto, where she is a member. She's given readings for her work across the country at bookstores, colleges, and universities, as well as on over 60 radio stations, including NPR. She's the mother, of 2 grown daughters and a stepdaughter, and lives with her husband and dog in Glen Park, San Francisco. Her latest memoir, Narrow Escapes, is the reason we are here tonight. Let's give another hand for Louise.
Thank you, Cara. Thank you. I thought I turned off my phone, and I think it just pinged. So I wanted to begin by thanking all of you who came tonight. I'm moved by, I think often people who are not writers think of writing as solely a solitary activity. And Louise and I were introduced to one another years ago through mutual friends. And her presence in my life, there have been times when we haven't seen a lot of each other, times when we've been in writing groups. But one thing I will always hold on to is that we had daughters. They were born very close in time to one another. I think they're about 7-8 months apart. And because as new mothers we weren't getting any sleep or writing time, we did an exchange where one of us would babysit for the other one, who would be sent off to a cafe to write, and then the other one would take her turn. And I've always held on to that as a picture of how important it is for artists and writers to be present in support of one another, as is true of Carr, a writer, a fine writer, a bookstore like this, and those of you who came tonight, many of you who practice as artists or writers. So thank you so much. I'm going to read first, and many of you know, and Louise is the main event, so she's got the new book. My book is very old, but what I retired a bit over a year ago, at the end of October in 2021, and I had a very hard time with it. I hated it, and I pulled myself out of the funk in a way by walking the city of San Francisco and taking pictures of little things I observed, and then I started posting them on Facebook, and eventually, it is really arrogant to say anything about Wordsworth, but he did realize at one point he was going to write this grand opus, and then he realized at one point that the walking was sort of the point, and that was what he wanted to reflect in his work. So I'm now trying to do that, get some incidents from the walk into my writing. So I'm going to read for a little under 10 minutes, and then Louise is going to read a section I recommended, and then we're going to talk, and then Louise will read a little more. That's our plan. Okay. Corner store. The girl with the braid raises her elbows high, then rests them on the counter. Her father doesn't say why she isn't in school. The man with scruff near his ears tries to chat them up before asking for a carton of cigarettes and 2 small bottles of whiskey. The girl with the braid reaches far across the counter to the penny dish and counts the cents, making change. Her father tips his head as if he could stoop to rest his ear on her shoulder. She's too small, yet helping. She smiles back at him, avoids the customer's eyes. The man tries to joke with her, reaches for cigarettes, touches the bottles with his fingertips, as if they were pennies too, and he might just leave them on the counter. The girl's father stands up straighter, his voice deeper. Maybe the customers are regular. Maybe he needs to move him along. I think my turn has come. I'm buying butter. Change in hand. It's rare to pay cash these days. But the man with the scruff near his ears raises an index finger. Wait a minute. He asks for 2 lottery tickets. 2 different games. As if this act were the usual. As if he were known for his faith in luck. As if his front tires weren't parked a half foot into the red zone. And he was nonchalant about change.
That's great.
I was having trouble titling these, so I sort of decided to title them by the route I was taking. This particular poem starts on the bus and then goes to the foot. And Stan was along for this. The 49 mission to North Point and Van Ness is on a rattle, barreling through its route up to 24th Street, where it slows and 2 women with tan-lined faces bang on the back door. They enter with a walker that holds an unzipped carrier and a wet-eyed dog that checks his view down the aisle. The women talk loudly about he and him on the first floor of their building. They thought he was gone, but he stopped them when they entered last night. I see now that one of them has a scar running from her temple to her cheek. Things pick up when a man limps aboard holding a dog similar in size to the dog in the women's carrier. He walks up the aisle to sit near them, and the dogs touch noses. "He's in heat," says a friend of the woman with the scar. "That's why he's interested in everything." We disembark at Market and walk toward the bay, past government buildings, new construction, boarded up storefronts, through wind and grit, and young men on scooters, dodging a motorized wheelchair with a loud boom box, people who limp, smoke, lurch, rearrange their plastic sheets. The rain has stopped, but the wind's picked up. Someone once told me you could be arrested for vagrancy if you didn't have $1. I kept one folded in my coin pocket for years. A petite cop is arresting a petite young man, and a mid-sized man is filming it. Here comes the pat down against the chain link fence. Does he have $1, a baggie, a weapon, a kit? New buildings with curved windows, opening soon optimism. Places named with fabricated words. Narrow entries, roll down doors, tagged on words, colors, the chill. On the street's north side, empty bank buildings bear up behind smooth marble steps, their columns shouting out permanence, their pigeon barriers glistening cones. This one's all on foot, kind of starting in Louise's neighborhood. Bosworth to Ocean. Red bubble letters cross the fence. Crisp edge marker writing snakes up the lamppost over yellow loops of paint, over stickers. The fennel, new and whiskery. Rose hips from last season by new roses. Someone left a bowl of water by their back door. Someone scraped Charlie plus Joey in the sidewalk. Weeks later, gunpowder gray paint covers the lamppost. The fennel goes to seed. Leaves drop scum on the water bowl. Charlie and Joey may still be in love. Pants slipping down from his hips, a bearded man rises out of the fennel and ivy below the freeway on-ramp. Behind the chain link fence, he looks caged. I walk faster now, past the hills and starlight painted on a fence by a garden gate, a concrete step, a lantern affixed, past a fire hydrant with an unscrewed hose attachment, a car with sunburned paint and rubber duckies glued around the rear window, frame, a gold Cadillac with a Frisco decal. The off-street paths reveal us, our torn basketball nets, our rusting trucks, sagging sheds, windfall apples, chickens, compost. Weeds push through gravel to show what we cannot control. They humiliate our will. Great. I forgot to look at what time I started. I'm sorry. So this one is a little bit longer. It's a prose poem. The artist-writer Deborah Pugh reached out to a bunch of women during the pandemic to ask us to write or create an image about a place that we felt safe when we were children. And it was kind of a response to being in COVID and feeling anxious all the time. And mine's called Longview. Mother said that was such an ugly house. How could she think so? It was surrounded by woods and sloping lawns, placed at the top of a street with such long views it was named Longview Road. In 1957, the local paper printed our address as the best place for viewing comets. My mother's view was not toward the heavens, but downward, a glare into nooks and crannies where grit might hide. Spick and span was a product and her aspiration. The house confounded her with its crevices. We were its second owners. The house was built by a man whose name started with H. He must have loved conveniences, as the house was filled with them. A laundry chute from the third floor to the basement, a dumb waiter behind an unmarked panel, Dutch doors, a built-in bar, a secret passageway running from the master bedroom closet to the far end of the hall. Susie and Sally, my childhood dolls, were decapitated due to many rides down the laundry chute. I ran down the stairs, but never reached the hamper before them. I was 5 when we moved there, And because of my advanced age and my mother's busyness with spick and span, it was the first house where I was left alone. Alone in the woods where I scrambled up a boulder, hunted for blueberries, chased Queenie's dog, alone on the swing set, alone in my bright white room on the upper floor. In later houses, I remembered being alone with my thoughts, but in that room, I was alone with light and textures, glossy paint on the windowsill, tongue and groove built-ins, tissue paper lining in drawers. I traced my finger across the grain in the wood, up to the edge of the rug. When it snowed, I pressed my lips against the cold window. The room contained a shallow built-in bookcase with breakables set up high and books I could shelve and reshelve near the floor. I would flip through them for full-page color illustrations, dragonflies and pixies, a brother and sister holding hands, following a path. There were black and white guides to cutting out a frieze of Christmas trees or making doll furniture out of pins and chestnuts. Solitude had a night side, too. We were raised with strict bedtimes, and I was a poor sleeper. The witch beneath the bed was my mother in a mood. I would lie still, imagining long needles jabbing through the mattress to prick me. If I rolled quickly to the edge, she'd miss me. I heard my breath, the thump-thump at the top of my jaw, eyelashes against the pillow, maws beneath the lampshade. While forbidden, I would get out of bed and slip to the pool of light in the middle of the floor. Sitting at its edge, I wished I could make shadow ducks, shadow rabbits. I saw them in a book. It only took hands and light. By myself, I was cold but safe, alive in my own story. So I read that in part to transition to Louise, because that was my, Sue and Bob, who are here, old friends of mine, know me from the Southern California suburb where I lived much of my life. But before that, we lived on the East Coast. And Louise and I have super clean households and mothers in common.
Not my household.
Right.
No.
But our homes where we were raised.
Yes,
Certainly. It was
yes.
a little, Stan will agree to this, that we would go home, open the door to my childhood bedroom, and it would be like Oz. It was so bright. It was kind of to do that. So I was wondering if you could read a little.
Yeah,
from the
well,
early
thank
part of
you
your
so
book.
much for your poetry.
Oh,
It was beautiful.
Thank you.
So I'm going to read first just briefly the epigraph of Narrow Escapes, because it's really a book about a journey. And at this point in my life, I kept getting places and leaving places, or meeting people to love and leaving them. So this is the Frank O'Hara epigraph. I wanted to be sure to reach you, though my ship was on the way, it got caught in some moorings. I am always tying up and then deciding to depart. So I'm going to read from the beginning, where I'm on my way to junior year abroad in France after working in the Yakima Valley with the American Friends Service Committee. So within one day, I went through something like 4 time zones. So, but I'm about to get on the ship, and I'm with my mother, who's seeing me off. Be careful. Don't be silly. Keep your traveler's checks and passport in your money belt. My mother said to me on the deck of the student ship, the Aurelia, before I left for France on my junior year abroad. My mother was a practical, no-nonsense woman who always had her ducks in a row. That July morning, only a few days before the moon landing in 1969, she wore a pressed khaki skirt, white silk shirt, and navy blue blazer. The daughter of a Presbyterian minister who adopted her at 9 after her biological father ran off, and a religious mother, she had pulled herself up with a master's degree in nursing education from Columbia University, unusual for a woman of her time. In 1942, she married my father, a Jewish doctor with Ivy League credentials. We had a beautiful home in Greenwich Village. My mother's impeccable dockside attire was in sharp contrast to my peasant blouse and ragged jeans, too tight for my thighs. I had gained 20 pounds drinking beer in the Yakima Valley, Washington, where I worked that summer with the American Friends, a Quaker organization helping in a migrant community. I almost dropped out of school and stayed in Washington, pulled like so many others towards doing community work. Plus, I had a love affair with Mateo, with some legal aid workers in Seattle who drove me to the airport late. I missed my flight. But I dutifully boarded the next flight and slept through the landing and takeoff in Chicago, groggy with leaving a place I loved and scared to go on the next journey. 5 days later, I stood on the deck of a huge ship that left for France. On the deck, my mother handed me a big floppy doll with brown braids and a pink flowered pinafore. "From that New England catalog," she said, looking at me and hoping I would accept her gift, even though I was too old for a doll. I turned away for a minute, aware of her scars and the smell of heavy cosmetics. Blobs of flesh like silly putty covered her face below her eyes and down her neck. You could see a thin red line where flesh from her stomach was sewn on, and a crisscross line like a jagged stitch on her neck flesh. Her eyebrows were drawn on with pencils, and her right eye was slightly bigger than the other. Her perfect outfits couldn't hide her reconstructed face. An explosion in the dank cellar of a summer rental in Wellfleet, Massachusetts. I was 4 years old. My mother's hands and face were blackened with burns. "No hot water to wash my face," my mother said to my dad when they got home. He held the flashlight as they climbed down the rickety ladder to the musty cellar to light the pilot light on the hot water tank. Gas with no smell had escaped. My mother lit the match. Blue flames ravaged her face and hands. My father, too. My mother's face would be unrecognizable. They narrowly escaped the fire. Earlier that evening, they had passed the gas men on the road and waved at them, 2 ordinary cars passing at twilight. My last memory before she lost her face, my mother kissing me goodbye, a lavender shawl swept over her shoulders, the scent of rose perfume, her shining eyes. A few minutes later, our fate was sealed. Our babysitter, Della, let the men in to change the propane tank, a faulty valve, 9 months of separation, a perfect storm of grief. Now, on the broad deck of the enormous student ship, my mother's smell was thick from cosmetics, covered over by Chanel perfume. I stared back at the strangers on deck who looked at her too long. "My mother is not a freak," I wanted to shout to the world. "Thanks, Mommy." Even though I was 19, I still called her Mommy, as if I could be 4 years old forever. I clutched the doll to me, rubbing my face over the thick brown braids. My mother stayed until the last minute. No hugs, just a quick peck on the cheek. Her white patent leather purse slung over her shoulder, she walked briskly back into the streets of Manhattan, away from the deep groaning sounds of the ship about to leave port. I wanted to run after her, to cling to her skirts and shout, "Mommy, don't go." I used to press my face against the window pane of our second-floor apartment, watching for her red coat coming back to me after one of her 37 operations. I tried to have faith that she'd always return, but I wasn't so sure. Now I was the one leaving. I took the steep steps down to my bunk, so low in the ship I didn't even have a porthole. 3 days later, a morning newspaper slid under my door. Men had landed on the moon and planted an American flag on that luminescent sphere. In small print, below all the fanfare about the moon landing, I saw a little boy had drowned in a stream full of reeds. Tears flooded my eyes. I felt so sad for him and his family to die in the reeds when America was celebrating the moon landing. Deep down, I lived in this chiaroscuro world, great joy shading to great grief.
So, Louise, I mentioned to you that I knew you've been working on this book for some time, and what I imagined the book to be was the story of your adventures, that kind of coming of age, and you and I are close in age and sort of a similar place in time. When I read the book, I realized that you're working with two levels of memory, that and one of the reasons I suggested you read this opening section was the memory of your adventures, but your parents' narrow escape is always there, right. And the two bump up against each other constantly. And I'm just wondering, did you start out knowing that would happen? Kind of how you had already written Burned, that was exclusively about the fire and your parents.
Yeah.
And so kind of how did you come to recognize that was the story?
Well, it's interesting. I think I wanted to release myself from Burned, and I thought, well, I'll write about Morocco. Mm-hmm. And that's how it started, with a personal essay about Morocco, which got rejected twice from somebody I'd sent it to. But she did say, well, this could be a book. So I just thought, I have a Morocco section where I'm actually hitchhiking in Morocco. And, it's not something I would normally do, but, it was just that time period. So I thought this book will be an adventure story, about writing. And then part of me thought, well, that's the external story. And honestly, I'm not sure. You could write a great book about adventures, but, I tend to be kind of internal. So I thought, I wanted to also have, well, what was going on with me? And full disclosure, I don't think that some of the sections in this book where I said, I thought about my mother and the burns or feeling abandoned by, some of that I put in there. And, when I teach memoir, I always say you're kind of the puppeteer. So I thought, okay, we have the narrow escapes, the external stuff, and then the inside stuff. So I worked on it, I revised it 4 times. Mm-hmm. Actually, I want to give a shout out to Melissa, who's here, who helped me with the whole book. And probably my first revision. So, so I've had, so it became, I'll just talk a little bit more. The first editor I had also said, your book is a journey. So it's the journey through Europe, then the journey going back home to New York City. And then all I had to, I don't know if the word is process exactly, but all I had to confront with my parents. And then I had to leave for some reason, which was honestly kind of a big sadness to leave home, but I had to leave. And then the last part of the book is driving solo across country. So it's a journey really in 3 sections. And so there's all the external stuff and then the internal stuff. And that's how the accident, I kind of put it through there, pretty consciously, I guess.
Right.
I didn't write the book consciously, but when I went back on the 3rd revision, like, okay.
Right. I was wondering, maybe there isn't more for me to draw out on that theme, but I knew you had worked on this book for a long time.
Right.
And that it went through changes, and I'm just sort of curious to know, well, first of all, good for you, because I am so lazy about the 4th revision of something, I'd say. But also kind of, were there other things that you really shifted as you went from that first version to what it ultimately came to be?
Yeah, one thing I was thinking about is that sometimes when you write, you just, You just assume that people know everything. You know, you know, the location or all these things that you have to say, no, they don't. And so I remember one question that my editor, the last editor I had, I worked with 2 editors, really 3 editors, said she didn't understand why one romance broke up. And I was just thinking, well, everybody could figure it out. No, not really. And first of all, when you're 19 or 20 and you break up with somebody, you have no idea. Oh yeah, it just didn't work. You know, I mean, you know, he was a perfectly nice person, so it wasn't like, oh, he sucked or he did something horrible to me. It just, we broke up. So I had to go back on really the 3rd or 4th revision and think of why, you know, why it didn't work. And what I finally came with that, I had a period of that time when I was having panic attacks and just having a hard time. And he was somebody who was very like, you know, a true artist, but in the clouds all the time. And so the 2 of us, you know, there was, you know, I was thinking there was nobody to bring me back to earth in some ways. And so that became clear. And then another character, Ken, you know, really a best friend, brought me back to earth. So they could kind of be foils for each other, you know. So, so those were some of the questions that she asked me, you know, why, a lot of why. And it's hard, you know, when you write, you don't want to explain everything in a boring way. So I had to have like a phone call where he was very, almost narcissistic, just thinking about himself, or that's how it came off to me. So it's like, no, he couldn't really, quote, be there for me. But my daughter read it at one point, and she thought I was probably making myself out to be too good. And so I added, I couldn't really be there for him either. So I think that was a really good addition. You know, I really thanked her for that. So a lot of things, yeah, to explain, I guess. Yeah.
You, in that answer, you mentioned the anxiety that you experience, which is also something that starts to come up about 3rd to half of the way through the book. It's a big theme. And one of the things that struck me was you were very trusting. I mean, hitchhiking in Morocco, you know, it's like, I mean, my dad told me that if he ever found out that I had hitchhiked, I would have to come home and live at home forever. So I never did. But I heard this interview with Michael Pollan on the radio talking about hallucinogenics in therapy, and he said often people with high levels of anxiety are in fact very trusting.
Interesting. I remember.
I'm just, you know, I'm curious to, where do I want to go with this question? I feel as if the road trip was where you started to come out of that.
Yeah, you know, I think,
you know, it's like you trusted some people on the road and they were good.
Yeah, you know, I think, you know, I try to deal with this in the book a little bit too. You know, besides the accident, which was horrible, you know, you can't take that away. I grew up in a very privileged way. I mean, my dad was a doctor. We lived in a beautiful house. I was able to go to this wonderful artsy, very radical, but very artsy private school. And there was a way in which my world, you know, I hardly ever saw a police officer. I hardly ever saw terrible things happen. And I was shy, but kind of a friendly kid who liked people. So I think some of that was just part of my nature. And I think the accident kind of, you know, put this whole level of anxiety. But if you stood in Paris, for instance, you know, wanting to hitchhike from Paris to somewhere else, there were like a whole lineup of people. It's like lining up for a restaurant or something. You know, it was a little unusual. It was better to hitchhike with a guy as a woman, to be honest. So the first time I tried to get into Morocco, I was turned away. That's a whole other story. But hitchhiking with another woman was a little bit risky, which I felt. but I so enjoyed, and probably still to this day, meeting people, or, maybe it was just, that was part of it, but I think I come off, I think my husband would say, as more naive than I really, am. I think in some of those car rides, one time when it was really risky, the guy had a little picture of two girls, on his dashboard, and I thought he was going to, sexually abuse us or harass us, and I said, oh, your little girls, they look so sweet, and I would try and do that. So I think there was some street smarts, but I can't imagine hitchhiking now. And it makes me sad because in a way, the world felt very open, not to everybody. Of course, there were terrible things happening, but, if somebody rang your doorbell, you didn't think, oh my God, they're going to rob me. It was just, oh, come in. And, so there was a wonderful trusting sense in the world then that's different now, I think.
Yeah. You and I are both boomers, which I know is annoying to many younger people. Our generation's so proud of our activism and so. And we were in different parts of the country during the 60s, 70s. I was wondering if could you tell a story of a kind of iconic incident, or, it's like, I know you knew Kathy Boudin. I know that, kind of your, sort of the newsworthy incident of the times or incidents that you came close to.
Yeah, well, I was, like probably a number of you, part of the civil rights protests and the marches on Washington. And I would say that, my heart was always in it, but I was a little nervous about putting myself in the middle of things. But so I would say the big thing that I did was at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, which was considered a very radical campus. There was Dow Chemical was coming to the campus, and of course they were making napalm at the time, being dropped on innocent people in Vietnam. And so I and probably only about 30 or 40 other people went and sat in the building, preventing Dow Chemical from coming in. And that was probably the bravest thing I did, was sitting there. But then my anxiety, and anxiety is not always bad by any means, reared its head, and I thought, I don't want to be here. This feels scary to me. And I was actually near the door, so I ran out, and 5 minutes later, cops came and just beat people bloody. I mean, I saw friends coming out, carted away in ambulances. And then a good friend of mine, Joanne, whose actually father worked with William Kunstler, who was, a big civil liberties lawyer. Anyway, she and I ran to the lake because we were tear gassed, and doused our eyes. And then we set up stations where we helped people. I guess it was egg white, I think, that you put on people who've been tear gassed. So, I was very much in the middle of it then, so that was probably. And there's actually a movie called The War at Home, which is about it. And of course, I'm sure I see myself there. But, I had long hair and a black coat, and everybody was there.
Had long hair and a black coat.
But that was probably the most terrifying incident, that I was in, But,
Throughout the book, there's a kind of refrain of sayings of your parents or advice from your parents. I told you the other day that my brother said to me, this was before I had a daughter, he said, you really know you're a parent when you hear yourself yelling something down the hallway that you didn't believe as a child. And I'm wondering your parents' well-intentioned advice, was there any of it that you chose to pass on to your daughters, or kind of what would you What would your refrain be for them?
Well, I was thinking about this today. My mom was an incredible person, kind of a challenging mother, in some ways emotionally. I think, there was, well, I don't want to reveal too much, but it's okay. Most of you aren't going to see my kids. But I think
It's being live streamed.
they're not going to watch it. But this is fine. They're in their mid to late 30s now. But I think I played, I guess, maybe the word isn't straight anymore, but I played more, I played myself as more conservative than I was, because I didn't, they know that I hitchhike now, but I didn't want to reveal all that. Mm-hmm. So I remember once finding cigarettes in my daughter Sarah's room. I don't know, it was in her room, and I knew she was probably smoking them, and she probably knew that, I knew. But I said, well, what are these? And she said, oh, they're friends. And I didn't say anything. It was like, you're not supposed to have them. So, sorry, I've been dealing with this chest thing, but I think my mother was very clear about, what you should do, shouldn't do. Mm-hmm. And one time when I was living in Buffalo and I was drinking much too much, as a lot of people do there, I came home and my mother was taking me, it's cold, taking me to an Italian restaurant, and I said, Mom, I really need a glass of wine. And she looked at me and she said, you need a glass of wine? It's kind of like you're not supposed to go over the edge, to, drink too much, take too many drugs. Even though before I left on my cross-country trip, she said, make sure you don't drink or smoke that marijuana. I remember thinking, she knows I smoke marijuana. But, so maybe that's the thing, playing like, you're not supposed to do certain things. So I'm going to, close my eyes to that. I mean, fortunately, nothing really terrible happened. I mean, so I wasn't dealing with addiction with myself or my kids, but yeah, kind of playing a certain way.
I'm going to turn to the audience for questions, but I think you wanted to read another little section.
Yeah, if I have time. Yeah. Sorry. This is when I was in Morocco, and this is a time when I didn't listen to what people told me, which was not to eat salad in the souk in Marrakesh, because you could get really sick. So I got really sick, and my friend Jacqueline, I changed her name, was taking me to a doctor on the Moroccan side of town because I was kind of playing poor, trying to be, quote, with the real people. And I could have gone to the European side of town. It was a whole thing. I didn't, anyway, but I'll just read it. Nayer, the doctor called out. My legs and hands quivered as I lifted myself out of the chair and walked with great hope to the doctor's office. I sat down in a chair. He looked haggard. His white coat hung loosely over a thin frame. He wore spectacles and looked down at me. I can't treat you, he said in English. Tears flooded my eyes. Why not? I need medicine. I'm very sick. Now tears gushed down my face. I can't treat you, he said again, and then whisked me out of his office, coming close to pulling me up from the chair and physically throwing me out of the room. Look at all these people I need to see. My people. Look at all these people. Go away. I could hardly talk as Jacqueline and I descended the stairs. I was a middle-class girl from America, a doctor's daughter. Why wasn't I at the European side of town near Jenny and Michael? The people. So many poor Moroccans sat in that waiting room, many with sick children on their laps, waiting and waiting for their medicine, and then a rich American comes in and takes one of their spots. I wanted to think of myself as a poor student, but I wasn't. Now too much time had elapsed to think, ruminate, cogitate, deliberate. You had to be deliberate to think, and I was losing that ability. Thoughts left my head and turned into blue, red, and yellow balloons that vanished into the sky. My parents could always wire me money, but I couldn't make that happen now or make anything happen. I was too sick, descending into hell when the hot air of the street hit me. People went by walking too fast. Why wasn't Jacqueline taking me to the European side of town? I imagined what I wanted her to do. If she had been a real best friend like Ken, this is what she would do. I'll take care of you. Just relax. We're going to get help from a doctor. Who cares about the money? I'll wire my parents. You're going to get better. She'd hug me and say, it will be okay. She'd whisk me in a cab, rush me somewhere, take charge. Red alert, 911, flashing buttons, sirens, ambulances. In Malaga, at the very beginning of our trip, when we jumped out of that crazy driver's car, I got ice for her, making sure she was okay. Where was she now? A buddy. I needed a buddy. These wretched thoughts drifted in and out of my consciousness. I was now back in the dorm. Jacqueline walked back with me, but now she was gone. I think she went shopping. I managed to climb to the top bunk, but my legs shook on each rung of the ladder. I wondered if my hands would hold me. I collapsed onto the thin mattress, smelling of my sickly, fetid, feverish sweat. A few words spun around and around, but it was a grinding sound I was hearing. My mind felt separated from itself, like puzzle pieces that don't fit, a round piece shoved into a square hole. Put nail polish on the rip. I could hear my mother's voice, bossy, comforting. Don't throw your stockings out. We've become too much of a throwaway society. I reached for my water bottle, thin, clear water, a bottle like a baby, but no one held me. I was in a tunnel of animal hides. I could hear drums like at the souk the night before. People came and went. No one noticed me. Then the room was empty. Then I was Tinkerbell, the tiny fairy from Peter Pan, who held a mirror near her, lit by a lamp. She was always surrounded by light. In Peter Pan, when Tinkerbell's light was dying, all who loved her clapped for her, and her light returned like an epiphany. At first it flickered, then died. But then suddenly, like a heart that starts beating again, the light surrounded her and she could soar. My sister and I watched Peter Pan on TV and would clap and clap. Why did anyone die? How could a sweet being die? I shivered and prayed I could keep some water in me. My breaths were thready and shallow. Had I been bad? I ate salad at the souk. I shouldn't have. Why did my parents return with burns over their bodies? Did I whine the day they were burned? Refuse to tie my shoes? One little stringy shoelace over the next? My eyes drowned with tears as shadows raged across the walls. My sister Annie and I played flashlight tag at night when we couldn't sleep, but these shadows came from the dark. I conjured up all the people who loved me, even my dead grandparents I'd never met, my Jewish grandparents on my dad's side, who came from Vilnius and died before I was born, Lena, David, Uncle Philip, and then the ones I knew in this life, Reverend Joseph and Fanny Daubert, my mother's father who called me his little buttercup and bought me books about animals at the 8th Street bookstore, Mom, Dad, and then the names of best friends. Then I heard the door open. A tall woman entered, long red hair and blue eyes, like my Aunt Rusty who cared for me when my parents were burned. Perhaps she rode here on wisps of Aunt Rusty's red hair. She put her things on her bed and then saw me. I lifted myself up for a minute and stared at her warm blue eyes. She plopped her stuff on a free bed, then came over to me. You're very, very sick. This is serious. I'm a nurse. Is it dysentery? She had an English accent. Yes, I said, my lips parched, slightly bloody. She rummaged in her purse and found charcoal tablets. These will stop the diarrhea, but you need fluids. Bowls of chicken soup and bottled water emerged from out of nowhere. For the first time in 3 nights, I didn't get up in the dark, my legs shaking each time. I rested all through the next day, the colors that had danced across the wall now turning white again. I took the charcoal tablets, slept for hours, and drank fluids, little by little getting my strength return. My angel, my nurse, my miracle.
Questions. And I'm supposed to repeat the questions if anybody has any. Yes, pretty.
So this is a little off the wall, but I'll ask it. Anyway, so you wrote this memoir. So how old do you think somebody has to be before they write a memoir? And I'll tell you where that comes from. I have a friend who's a former student who's about 22 maybe, and she just wrote a memoir. And I have only read parts of it, but is there that much to say when you're 20? Anyways.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a good. Oh,
Oh,
sorry.
I'm just supposed to repeat the question. I don't want to. Oh, just the question is, how old do you need to be to write a memoir? And the example given was a former student who was 22 writing a memoir. And is there enough to say, to know at that point?
Well, I think it's a good question. When I teach memoir, I talk about perspective, that as you get older, and when I wrote Burned, it was originally like, what about me? I wasn't physically burned, but I suffered, and I wanted to write about that, which was real. But as I evolved, I really included my parents more in it. So it's a part of an evolution. But, I don't necessarily think about age as I think more about wisdom. I forgot the name of I think she was Iranian, the woman who had, had acid in her eye. I can't remember. She was very young when she wrote a memoir. So I think it's more, I don't know, how you tell it, your perspective, the ability to do it. I guess age can give you wisdom, not always, but.
Oh, I hope so.
Yes.
Okay. I was thinking about your last piece, the one you read, and it's so beautiful. And the way that you, as a young person, older person, experiencing as a young person, and having this stream of consciousness, of course, which was exaggerated by the illness and the fever.
Right.
But that kind of delusional stream of consciousness is certainly available to someone who's 22.
Yeah.
It's more you're being present.
Yeah.
And you're so gifted with that.
Oh gosh, thank you. Yeah.
Bringing the sensory images, all of them, taste, smell, tactile, and then the memories. I loved how you brought in the Peter Pan and Tinkerbell, coming back to life because they clap.
Yeah.
And then Nurse just coming in. So the braiding of all that, of course, is your skill as a writer. But the perception of experience, I think the way you were also on the bus,
Yeah.
looking at life in detail and seeing what's there is all part of memoir. Do you think that's true?
Oh, totally. And I think, Frances and I share the, being poets. Originally I did poetry, was just, the love of language, looking at things. I mean, all the beautiful specifics and what you read, Frances, that, and I think, it's just something that I love doing, letting go and just feeling that sense world and being engaged with it. And certainly when you're sick, you're just in the present. It's very hard to think of the future or the past, or things go through your mind. All you want to do is get better. So
I'm not going to try to replicate your very beautiful appreciation, or that it contained a bit of a question, but I feel responsible for the recording to say that she was admiring in Louise's reading in particular, the weaving of past and present, the use of stream of consciousness that was so appropriate to represent the period when she was very ill, and and overall the really terrific use of sensory experience. Other questions? There was another hand. Yes.
Yeah. So you were talking a little bit about your children. Were there things that they really did not know that made its way in the book that were a revelation? And did they have to fact check you on anything and say, "Oh, that's not right"?
So the question is about Louise has 2 children, and in reading this memoir,
Or
did
Jim.
they? Yeah, or Jim. Were there things that they didn't know, and did they press you on the factual nature of your memories?
well, it's interesting. They did not read maybe sections of Burned. I think it was so heavy, and it was a big part. I was trying to get it published when they were young, so I would go, "Oh, yay! Somebody's interested, somebody's not." I think it. And they knew my parents as burned. They were burned, but maybe they didn't want to deal with all of that. Anyway, so that so Laura, only one of my daughters has read this, and she helped me with it a bit. She's a really good editor. So I haven't had a big heart-to-heart, and I'm not sure Sarah actually will read it, and Jim, my husband, has read it. I think, when you're reading about your old boyfriends and talking to your husband, it's not always like, after a while, I mean, he was very supportive, but it's like, that's my story too. So, so I would say no, there isn't some huge openness. Maybe I wanted that or wished for it, or we'd all talk about my life in the book. And then I think maybe you don't want to read about, your mother's, love affairs and panic attacks. I don't know, they know all of it anyway, but it's complicated, I think, yeah.
Louise, may I jump in and ask you a question that's from the other generation, which is, do you think you would have published it when your parents were still alive?
No. I don't think so. And I didn't publish Burned. My mother looked at some of it. She was an editor, so she looked at some of it. But I think probably not. It freed me more. And I don't think so. Yeah. And that's a part of memoir too, the ethical concerns, and I guess it was much more comfortable after they died.
Okay. Anybody want any finale questions? Perhaps everything has been said. Louise has copies of Fresh Off the Press, Narrow Escape. I have copies of my book, which has been in storage in Queens for about 20 years. But Card graciously agreed to make them available. So if anybody wants a book signed, we have some time with the author, and I really want to thank Louise for inviting me to be part of this.
Well, thank you for setting it up. And by the way, Frances and I now go swimming together every Tuesday morning, and it's just been totally wonderful. So, and to
really
reconnect.
fun.
Yeah.
And we don't let the guys push us out of the fast section.
We go in the fast section. Well, thank you all for who you are.
Can we give one more hand to Louise Nayer and Frances Phillips? I want to be as brief as possible and end on the lovely note that you left it on. So I am just here to express my gratitude once again to both of you for joining us and to all of you for joining us. And we have copies of both of these writers' books available at the front. You can find them there and bring them back here to have them signed. And we'll see you next time. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Colin.